May 8, 1945 marked the day Europe's guns finally fell silent. But for Paul Nitze, a 38-year-old American economist turned strategic bombing analyst, the real work had only just begun. While millions celebrated Victory in Europe Day in the streets of London, Paris, and New York, Nitze boarded a military transport plane, bound for the shattered remains of the Third Reich, with a question burning in his mind. Had American bombing truly crippled Nazi Germany's war machine, or had something else brought the regime to its knees? The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Nitze, working for the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, had been tasked with assessing the effectiveness of Allied air campaigns against German industrial targets. For months, he and his team had sifted through mountains of rubble, interviewed factory workers, and examined production records salvaged from bombed-out offices. The numbers told a puzzling story, one that contradicted everything the military brass had claimed about precision bombing's devastating impact. Then came the opportunity of a lifetime. Allied forces had captured Albert Speer, Adolf Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, the man who had transformed Germany's chaotic war economy into a streamlined industrial powerhouse. Speer possessed knowledge that no amount of aerial reconnaissance or captured documents could provide. The truth about Germany's production capacity, its resource limitations, and the real effects of Allied bombing on the Nazi war effort. Nitze's superiors arranged for him to conduct an extended interrogation of Speer at a secure facility in Flensburg, near the Danish border. The setting was surreal, a once grand hotel now serving as a holding area for high-ranking Nazi prisoners. Guards patrolled the perimeter while inside. War criminals who had commanded millions now shuffled through hallways under constant surveillance. Speer, still impeccably dressed despite his circumstances, maintained an air of professional detachment that both impressed and disturbed his captors. On May 15, 1945, Nitze entered the interrogation room for the first of what would become 7 consecutive days of intensive questioning. The room was sparse, a wooden table, 3 chairs, and a single window overlooking the gray waters of the Flensburg Firth. A stenographer sat in the corner, fingers poised over her typewriter, ready to record every word. Speer rose as Nitze entered, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed almost absurdly civilized given the circumstances. Nitze had prepared meticulously for this encounter. He carried thick folders containing production statistics, bombing raid reports, and intelligence assessments. But as he sat down across from Hitler's architect-turned-armaments minister, he realized that this interrogation would be unlike any intelligence gathering he had previously conducted. Speer was no ordinary prisoner. The man possessed a photographic memory for industrial statistics, an architect's eye for systematic organization, and, most surprisingly, an apparent willingness to speak candidly about the regime he had served until its final apocalyptic days. "Herr Nitze," Speer began in precise, grammatically flawless English, "I understand you wish to know about our production capabilities. I can tell you things that will fundamentally change your understanding of this war." Those words proved prophetic in ways neither man could have anticipated. Over the next week, their conversations would unravel assumptions, expose miscalculations, and ultimately reveal a truth about American industrial power that would reshape Nitze's worldview, and eventually American strategic thinking for decades to come. The interrogation began with what Nitze considered the central question: how severely had Allied bombing campaigns damaged German war production? He spread reconnaissance photographs across the table, images of Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories reduced to skeletal frameworks, the synthetic oil refineries at Luna shrouded in smoke, the Krupp steelworks in Essen transformed into a landscape of twisted metal and rubble. Speer studied each photograph with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining X-rays. He acknowledged the destruction, but then delivered his first shocking revelation. German armaments production had not peaked in 1941 or 42, as Allied intelligence had assumed. Instead, despite the intensifying bomber offensive, production had reached its absolute zenith in July of 1944, 3 years into sustained Allied bombing campaigns. Nitze's pen hovered over his notepad. This contradicted everything the United States Army Air Forces had claimed about their strategic bombing doctrine. Speer continued, explaining that Germany had entered the war with massive overcapacity in many industries and shocking inefficiency in utilizing its workforce. The Führer's reluctance to fully mobilize the German economy until late in the war, combined with the regime's chaotic administrative structure, had meant that peacetime production methods persisted well into 1943. "We were producing grand pianos while our soldiers fought in Russia," Speer said with a bitter smile. "Germany only became truly serious about total war production after Stalingrad, after the disaster in North Africa. Your bombs destroyed factories, yes, but they also forced us to rationalize, to eliminate waste, to finally organize ourselves properly." This information aligned with data Nitze had gathered from other sources, material referenced in reports from the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee. The pattern was undeniable. German tank production had increased from approximately 6,000 units in 1942 to over 19,000 in 1944. Aircraft production told the same story, from 15,000 planes to 40,000, despite round-the-clock bombing raids. Speer walked Nitze through the mechanics of Germany's improvised resilience. When bombers destroyed the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, raids that had cost the 8th Air Force 60 aircraft and 600 crewmen in a single day, German industry had responded by dispersing production into hundreds of smaller facilities, simplifying designs to reduce ball-bearing requirements, and substituting alternative materials. When synthetic oil refineries burned, the regime had ruthlessly reallocated existing fuel supplies, grounding training programs, and restricting civilian transport to keep frontline units mobile. The second day of interrogation brought even more disturbing revelations. Nitze asked about Germany's resource constraints, particularly the critical shortage of chromium, tungsten, and other exotic metals necessary for advanced weapons production. Speer's response revealed the global reach of Nazi Germany's war economy. Chromium from Turkey, tungsten from Portugal, iron ore from Sweden. Supposedly neutral nations had kept Germany's furnaces burning throughout the war. "We were never as isolated as your propaganda suggested," Speer explained. "Until quite late in the war, we maintained supply lines through supposedly neutral countries. Swiss precision machinery, Spanish tungsten, Swedish steel, these things continued flowing almost until the end." But it was on the third day that Speer began to describe what had truly defeated Germany, and his words would haunt Nitze for the rest of his life. The architect-turned-minister leaned back in his chair and asked a question that inverted the entire interrogation. "Herr Nitze, have you calculated American production figures for 1944? Not just military production, but total industrial output?" Nitze admitted he had not examined those numbers comprehensively. His focus had been on assessing bombing effectiveness, not analyzing American economic capacity. Speer nodded slowly, and something resembling awe crept into his voice. Speer rose from his chair and approached the window, gazing out at the gray waters of the Flensburg Firth. Guards paced below, their rifles slung casually over shoulders. The war was over, and these prisoners posed no physical threat. But the information Speer was about to share would prove more explosive than any weapon Germany had manufactured. "In 1943, I convinced the Führer to commission a comprehensive study of Allied industrial capacity," Speer began, his reflection ghostly in the window glass. "We needed to understand what we were truly facing. The results terrified me, though I dared not show it in the Führer's presence." He returned to the table and asked Nitze for a sheet of paper. With precise strokes, Speer began sketching out production figures from memory, numbers that Nitze would later verify through American records and find disturbingly accurate. The architect's methodical mind had retained statistics the way others remembered faces or melodies. According to Speer's intelligence reports, the United States had produced approximately 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Germany, even at its peak production, had managed only 40,000. But the disparity in aircraft production was merely the beginning. American shipyards had launched cargo vessels at a rate that defied belief. A Liberty ship every day, sometimes two. Germany's U-boat campaign had been designed to sink merchant vessels faster than the Allies could replace them, but American shipyards had turned that calculus into a fatal German miscalculation. Nitze interjected with a question about tanks and armored vehicles. Speer's response was crushing in its implications. The United States had produced approximately 17,000 Sherman tanks in 1944, along with tens of thousands of other armored vehicles, tank destroyers, and self-propelled artillery pieces. Germany had managed approximately 19,000 tanks and assault guns total, a number that seemed impressive until one considered that America was simultaneously supplying the British, equipping the Soviets through Lend-Lease, and maintaining forces across 2 oceans and 4 continents. "But here is what truly defeated us," Speer said, leaning forward with an intensity that made the stenographer's fingers pause on her typewriter. It was not just military production. America maintained, even increased, its civilian standard of living while waging global war. Your citizens had automobiles, refrigerators, adequate food, consumer goods. We were demanding total sacrifice from the German people while you were producing both guns and butter. This observation, drawn from intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations conducted by German authorities, had profoundly affected Nazi calculations about American resolve. Hitler had believed that democratic societies lacked the will for sustained sacrifice, that American morale would collapse under the strain of war. Instead, the United States had demonstrated something far more demoralizing to Germany's leadership: the ability to wage total war while maintaining peacetime prosperity. Speer described how this realization had gradually spread through Germany's military and industrial leadership. By late 1943, anyone with access to accurate intelligence understood that Germany was not fighting a war. It was drowning in an avalanche of American production. Every destroyed German tank could be replaced eventually, but it faced 10 or 15 new American tanks. Every lost aircraft confronted dozens of replacements. Even Germany's technological advantages, the jet aircraft, advanced U-boats, and rocket weapons, came too late and in too few numbers to matter. On the 4th day of interrogation, Nitze steered the conversation toward the effectiveness of specific bombing campaigns. If German production had continued increasing despite the bombs, what had the strategic air offensive actually accomplished? Speer's answer was nuanced and, in some ways, more supportive of strategic bombing than the Americans' own inflated claims. The bombing campaign had not stopped German production, but it had prevented that production from increasing even further. More critically, it had forced Germany to divert enormous resources to air defense, resources that could otherwise have been deployed against Allied ground forces. By 1944, Germany was manufacturing more anti-aircraft guns than tanks, devoting hundreds of thousands of soldiers to air defense duties, and consuming precious fuel in defensive fighter operations rather than supporting ground combat. "Your bombers forced us to fight a second front in our own skies," Speer acknowledged. "We produced 60,000 anti-aircraft guns during the war, 60,000 weapons that fired at empty sky most of the time, while your armies advanced on the ground. We assigned over 1 million men to air defense duties. Imagine if those men had been available on the Eastern Front or defending France." By the 5th day of interrogation, Nitze had accumulated enough material to fill several comprehensive reports, but Speer's revelations continued to deepen and complicate the picture. The morning session began with a discussion of Germany's labor force, and here Speer's testimony took on a darker tone, one that revealed both his administrative genius and his complicity in the regime's crimes. Germany's war production had relied increasingly on slave labor, concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, and forcibly conscripted civilians from occupied territories. Speer had overseen the allocation of millions of these workers to factories, mines, and construction sites. He spoke of this system with the same bureaucratic detachment he had applied to discussing ball-bearing production, describing the workers as production units, and discussing mortality rates with chilling matter-of-factness. Nitze found himself in an ethically complex position. His mission was to gather information about industrial production and bombing effectiveness, not to prosecute war crimes. Yet Speer's casual admissions of using slave labor, of working people to death in factories and mines, revealed the moral abyss at the heart of Nazi Germany's war economy. The stenographer's typing slowed, then stopped, as Speer described conditions in underground factories where V-2 rockets were assembled by prisoners who rarely saw daylight. But even here, Speer returned to the theme that had dominated the interrogation: Germany's fundamental material disadvantage. The slave labor system, horrific as it was, had represented desperate improvisation rather than effective strategy. Productivity per worker in German factories lagged far behind American standards. Exhausted, malnourished slave laborers could not match the output of well-fed American workers operating modern machinery. Sabotage was common, quality control nearly impossible. "We enslaved millions and still could not match your production," Speer said quietly. "What does that tell you about the relative strength of our systems?" The afternoon session of the fifth day brought Nitze to questions about Germany's strategic decision-making at the highest levels. How had Hitler and his inner circle responded to intelligence about American industrial capacity? Had they understood what they were facing? Speer's answer revealed the fantasy world at the heart of Nazi Germany's leadership. Hitler had repeatedly dismissed intelligence reports about American production as enemy propaganda or exaggeration. When Speer had presented detailed analyses of Allied industrial capacity, the Führer had responded with ideological assertions about American racial inferiority and predictions that the alliance between capitalist America and communist Russia would inevitably collapse. "The Führer believed that will could triumph over material," Speer explained. He cited Frederick the Great's victories against numerically superior enemies, Germany's resilience in the First World War. He convinced himself, and many of us, that determination and superior German organization would overcome American industrial power. This willful denial had extended throughout Germany's command structure. Generals planned operations based on optimistic assumptions about equipment availability. Industrial planners set production targets that ignored raw material shortages. The regime's propaganda had been so effective that even Germany's leadership had begun believing its own lies. On the sixth day, Nitze asked Speer when he had personally realized that Germany could not win the war. The minister's response was precise. Late 1943, after reviewing comprehensive intelligence about the scale of American industrial mobilization. By that point, Speer had understood that Germany was caught in an irreversible trajectory toward defeat. Yet he had continued working, rationalizing production, and implementing efficiency measures for another 16 months. "Why?" Nitze asked. "If you knew defeat was inevitable, why continue?" Speer's answer revealed the psychological complexity of Germany's final years. Partly from fear, speaking defeatism meant death. Partly from denial, perhaps a miracle weapon or political realignment would change the equation. Partly from professional pride, he had built something efficient from Germany's chaotic industrial structure and wanted to prove what it could achieve. And partly from a failure of moral courage, he had not dared to actively sabotage the regime or work for its earlier defeat. This conversation, documented in official United States Strategic Bombing Survey records, revealed Speer as a man of contradictions. Technically brilliant but morally compromised, clear-eyed about Germany's strategic position, yet unable to act on that knowledge, capable of recognizing American industrial superiority while continuing to serve a regime built on racial delusion. As the sixth day ended, Nitze realized that Speer's testimony was providing something unexpected, not just data about German production or bombing effectiveness, but insight into how a modern industrial state had prosecuted total war and how it had failed. The lessons were not just about tonnages and production statistics, but about the relationship between industrial capacity, political systems, and strategic outcomes. The seventh and final day of interrogation began with Nitze asking Speer to describe Germany's economic situation in the final months of the war, from January through May of 1945. The minister's response painted a picture of systematic collapse, not the sudden catastrophic failure that Allied bombing advocates had predicted, but a gradual disintegration as accumulated damage, resource shortages, and territorial losses finally overwhelmed German improvisation. By January of 1945, the bombing campaign's cumulative effects had begun to matter more than any single raid. Germany's transportation network, the railways, canals, and roads that moved raw materials to factories and finished weapons to the front, had deteriorated beyond repair. Bombers had destroyed bridges, marshalling yards, and locomotives faster than Germany could replace them. Factories might still stand, but they lacked coal for power, steel for production, and means to ship completed equipment. The loss of territory compounded these problems catastrophically. The Soviet advance into Eastern Europe had severed Germany from Romanian oil fields in August of 1944. The capture of the Saarland by American forces eliminated a major coal-producing region. Each territorial loss removed resources, factories, and workers from Germany's economic base, creating a downward spiral that no amount of organizational efficiency could reverse. Speer described the bizarre final months when Germany's war economy had become almost surreal. Factories produced tanks that could not move for lack of fuel. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines but could not fly because training programs had been canceled to conserve gasoline. Ammunition plants manufactured shells that could not reach artillery units because the transportation network had collapsed. In early April of 1945, Germany had possessed substantial stockpiles of weapons and ammunition, but they were scattered across the shrinking Reich, unusable because movement had become impossible. "We had created an industrial corps," Speer said. "The factories still functioned, workers still arrived for shifts, but the organism as a whole was dead. We were manufacturing weapons for an army that no longer existed, defending a regime that had already fallen." Nitze pressed Speer on a crucial question. If the strategic bombing campaign had not destroyed German production capacity in the way claimed, what should American planners have done differently? Speer's response would later influence American strategic thinking about bombing campaigns in future conflicts. According to Speer, the most effective bombing strategy would have focused earlier and more consistently on Germany's transportation network and oil production. The dramatic raids on cities like Hamburg and Dresden had generated headlines and terrified civilians, but had not significantly impacted war production. In contrast, the systematic campaign against synthetic oil refineries, begun in earnest only in mid-1944, had been devastating. Similarly, the concentrated attacks on transportation infrastructure in early 1945 had achieved more strategic effect in months than years of factory bombing. If you had focused on oil and transportation from the beginning, Speer suggested, the war might have ended in 1944. But your air forces were too captivated by the idea of destroying factories, as if war production happened in isolation from the larger economic system. This critique aligned with conclusions Nitze was developing independently. The Strategic Bombing Survey was revealing that precision bombing of specific industrial targets had been far less effective than its advocates claimed, but systematic attacks on economic infrastructure had succeeded beyond expectations. The lesson was not that strategic bombing had failed, but that American bombers had often attacked the wrong targets with unrealistic expectations about results. The conversation then shifted to a topic that had emerged repeatedly throughout the week: the fundamental difference between American and German economic systems. Speer had been impressed, even awed, by American industrial capacity, but he struggled to understand its source. Germany had mobilized its economy totally for war, imposed rigid state control, and driven workers through a combination of ideological fervor and terror. Yet America, with its chaotic free market system and limited government control, had vastly outproduced the Reich. Nitze offered an explanation that would later appear in his reports. America's economic strength derived not from superior organization. German organization had been remarkably efficient once Speer had reformed it, but from decades of accumulated capital investment, advanced industrial technology, high worker productivity, and access to essentially unlimited raw materials. The United States had spent the 1920s and 30s building industrial capacity that Germany could not match or replicate. By 1940, before America had even entered the war, its industrial base was larger than Germany's, Japan's, and Italy's combined. As the final interrogation session stretched into the afternoon, Speer became reflective, even philosophical. He acknowledged that Germany had lost the war not in 1945 or even 1944, but perhaps as early as December of 1941, when Hitler had declared war on the United States following Pearl Harbor. From that moment, Germany had faced an enemy whose industrial capacity made ultimate victory impossible. "We were doomed the moment America entered the war," Speer said. "Not immediately. You needed time to mobilize, to build your forces, to learn how to fight. But the mathematics of production made the outcome inevitable. The only question was how long we could delay the final reckoning. This admission struck Nitze with particular force. If German leadership had understood this reality, why had they continued fighting for 3.5 more years? Why had they not sought a negotiated settlement in 1942 or 43, before Germany was completely destroyed? Speer's answer revealed the totalitarian trap that had ensnared Germany. The Nazi regime's ideological nature made rational strategic calculation impossible. Hitler could not negotiate because his worldview permitted only absolute victory or apocalyptic destruction. The regime had murdered millions and waged wars of annihilation. Its leaders knew they would face justice if they surrendered. So they had continued fighting, sacrificing millions more lives, even after any rational hope of victory had vanished. We were not fighting to win, Speer admitted. By late 1943, we were fighting to delay defeat, to bargain for better terms, or simply because we did not know what else to do. The machine we had built could only move in one direction, toward destruction. Nitze asked about the impact of Germany's atrocities, particularly the Holocaust, on the war effort. Speer's response was evasive and self-serving. He claimed limited knowledge of the extermination camps, presenting himself as a technocrat focused solely on industrial production. Yet his testimony about slave labor and his access to Germany's highest councils made these denials implausible. He had known, or had chosen not to know, which amounted to the same moral failure. What Speer would admit was that the resources devoted to genocide, the trains, fuel, personnel, and administrative effort required to murder millions, had diverted capacity from the war effort. But this admission came wrapped in pragmatic rather than moral terms, as if the Holocaust's greatest crime had been its inefficiency rather than its evil. As the interrogation wound toward its conclusion, Nitze asked Speer to summarize the key factors that had led to Germany's defeat. The minister's answer was comprehensive and, Nitze later realized, largely accurate. First, the fundamental material imbalance between Germany and its enemies, particularly the United States. Germany had never possessed sufficient raw materials, industrial capacity, or manpower to win a prolonged war against the combined Allied powers. Second, Hitler's strategic errors, declaring war on America, failing to mobilize Germany's economy for total war until too late, pursuing ideological rather than rational objectives, and micromanaging military operations with disastrous results. Third, the quality and determination of Allied soldiers, which German propaganda had consistently underestimated. American, British, and Soviet forces had proven far more capable and resilient than Nazi racial theories had predicted. Fourth, the cumulative effect of Allied bombing, which had not destroyed German production, but had prevented it from growing even larger, forced massive diversion of resources to air defense, and eventually crippled transportation and oil supply systems. Fifth, and perhaps most important, the nature of the Nazi regime itself. Its totalitarian structure had prevented honest assessment of Germany's strategic position. Its racial ideology had alienated potential allies and motivated enemies, and its criminal policies had made negotiated peace impossible. We built our Reich on mythology rather than reality, Speer concluded. We believed in German superiority, in the power of will over material, in the destiny of the Aryan race. And reality destroyed us. As the 7-day interrogation concluded, Nitze thanked Speer formally and gathered his notes. The stenographer collected her transcripts, thousands of pages that would be typed, analyzed, and incorporated into official reports. Guards escorted Speer back to his cell, where he would remain until his trial at Nuremberg. Walking out of the interrogation facility into the late May sunshine, Nitze felt intellectually exhausted, but also exhilarated. He had conducted hundreds of interviews during his work with the Strategic Bombing Survey, but none had been as comprehensive or revealing as this week with Speer. The German minister's testimony had confirmed some suspicions, demolished others, and revealed patterns that Nitze was only beginning to understand. The weeks following the Speer interrogation proved transformative for Nitze's understanding of modern warfare and industrial power. He returned to his Strategic Bombing Survey offices in Frankfurt, where teams of analysts were processing mountains of data from captured German records, factory inspections, and hundreds of additional interviews. Nitze's notes from the Speer sessions became required reading for senior analysts, and the minister's observations about American production capacity sparked intense discussions. What emerged from these deliberations was a conclusion that made many American military leaders uncomfortable. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved significant results, but not in the way its advocates had predicted or claimed. The precision bombing of specific factories had been far less effective than promised. German industry had proven remarkably resilient and adaptable. Production had continued increasing despite the bombs, right up until the final collapse of the transportation system and territorial integrity. However, Nitze and his colleagues concluded that strategic bombing had succeeded in three crucial ways. First, by forcing Germany to devote enormous resources to air defense, resources that could not be used on the battlefield. Second, by gradually destroying Germany's transportation network and oil production, which eventually strangled the war economy. Third, by maintaining constant pressure that prevented German industry from achieving its full potential and exhausted the workforce through disruption and terror. These conclusions appeared in the final strategic bombing survey reports, completed in the latter half of 1945. The report's nuanced findings disappointed both critics and advocates of strategic bombing. Critics wanted vindication that bombing had failed. Advocates demanded validation that precision bombing could win wars independently. Instead, the reports presented bombing as one element of combined warfare, valuable but not decisive, effective when properly targeted, but wasteful when misdirected. But Speer's observations about American industrial capacity had sparked something deeper in Nitze's thinking. The Economist began compiling statistics on American war production, seeking to quantify the overwhelming material advantage the United States had wielded. The numbers, when fully assembled, were staggering. During World War II, American factories had produced approximately 300,000 aircraft of all types: bombers, fighters, transports, trainers. German production had totaled approximately 120,000. American shipyards had launched cargo vessels with a combined capacity exceeding 50 million deadweight tons. Germany, Britain, and Japan combined had not matched half that figure. American factories had produced 88,000 tanks, over 2 million trucks, 40 billion rounds of ammunition and military equipment valued at approximately $186 billion at 1945 prices. These figures represented roughly 40% of all military production by all combatants during the entire war. The United States, fighting across two oceans simultaneously, supplying allied nations through Lend-Lease, had outproduced the rest of the world combined, and it had done this while maintaining civilian consumption levels that seemed almost obscene compared to the deprivation in other warring nations. Nitze began to understand that America had not simply outfought its enemies. It had outproduced them so thoroughly that military excellence became almost secondary. A mediocre American tank like the Sherman had prevailed over technically superior German tanks partly through numerical overwhelming. 5 or 6 Shermans could afford to lose 3 in exchange for destroying 1 German Tiger, because American factories would replace the losses within weeks, while Germany struggled for months to build a single new heavy tank. This realization had profound implications for post-war American strategy. If industrial capacity had been the decisive factor in World War II, then maintaining and expanding that capacity would be essential for future security. Moreover, denying similar industrial power to potential enemies, particularly the Soviet Union, would become a strategic imperative. In late 1945, Nitze began work on a secret study examining Soviet industrial capacity and comparing it to American production levels. The results were troubling. Soviet factories, rebuilt and expanded during the war with American Lend-Lease assistance, now represented the only industrial base that could potentially challenge American capacity. The Soviets had demonstrated impressive production of tanks, artillery, and aircraft during the war. Their population was larger than America's, their access to raw materials comparable. This analysis, combined with emerging tensions between former allies, led Nitze toward conclusions about the post-war world that would define his career. If industrial capacity determined strategic outcomes, then the coming competition with the Soviet Union would be fundamentally economic. Military forces mattered, but the ability to produce those forces, to sustain them during prolonged conflict, to replace losses, and maintain technological advantage. These capacities would determine which system prevailed. Nitze's thinking evolved toward what would later be called containment strategy, the idea that American power should be used to prevent Soviet expansion and limit Soviet access to additional industrial resources while the United States maintained and expanded its own economic base. The strategy assumed a prolonged competition in which neither side would risk direct military confrontation, but both would compete through proxies, economic aid, technological advancement, and alliance building. In January of 1946, Nitze submitted his final reports to the Strategic Bombing Survey and prepared to transition to new roles in the emerging national security apparatus. The Speer interrogation had marked a turning point in his career, transforming him from an economist, analyzing bombing effectiveness, into a strategic thinker, grappling with fundamental questions about power, production, and international competition. The insights gained from those 7 days in Flensburg continued to influence American strategic thinking for decades. When Nitze later became director of the State Department's policy planning staff in 1949, he helped draft NSC 68, the foundational document of America's Cold War strategy. That document emphasized economic and industrial capacity as the fundamental basis of national power, a conclusion drawn directly from his World War II experiences and the Speer interrogation. NSC 68 argued that the Soviet Union, despite its military strength, suffered from economic vulnerabilities that could be exploited through sustained Western pressure. If the United States maintained its industrial base, supported European recovery through the Marshall Plan, and forced the Soviets into an economically draining arms competition, the communist system would eventually prove unsustainable. This strategy assumed that America's economic system, decentralized, innovative, efficient, would outproduce Soviet central planning in the same way it had overwhelmed Nazi Germany. Historians analyzing this period, including accounts documented in major historical journals and archives, have noted the direct connection between lessons learned from studying Nazi Germany's economic defeat and strategies developed for confronting the Soviet Union. The Speer interrogation, though just one of thousands conducted after World War II, provided insights that resonated throughout American strategic planning for the next 4 decades. Meanwhile, Albert Speer faced trial at Nuremberg, where he was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for his use of slave labor and his role in the Nazi regime. He received a 20-year prison sentence, a relatively lenient punishment that reflected his cooperation with Allied investigators and his expressions of remorse. Many survivors of Nazi slave labor camps found the sentence outrageously inadequate, arguing that Speer's technical skill had prolonged the war and thus increased the Holocaust's death toll. Speer served his full sentence, refusing early release opportunities, and was freed from Spandau prison in October of 1966. He spent his remaining years writing memoirs that portrayed himself as a technocrat who had opposed Hitler's worst excesses, a self-serving narrative that historians have largely debunked. Yet his testimony about German war production, including the information provided to Nitze, has been verified and remains valuable for understanding World War II's economic dimensions. Nitze's own career continued to intersect with questions about industrial power and strategic competition. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, he served on the executive committee advising President Kennedy. The crisis was resolved partly through American conventional military superiority in the Caribbean, superiority that derived from decades of sustained industrial investment that the Soviet Union could not match. Later, as a negotiator for arms control agreements, Nitze consistently emphasized verification and limitations on Soviet industrial capacity to produce weapons systems. He understood that paper agreements meant little if one side could dramatically outproduce the other during a crisis. The lesson from Speer remained relevant. Industrial capacity, not just existing military forces, determined strategic outcomes. The Vietnam War tested these assumptions and revealed their limitations. American industrial superiority proved insufficient against a guerrilla insurgency supported by external powers. The ability to produce unlimited bombs, helicopters, and supplies could not compensate for political constraints, geographic disadvantages, and enemy determination. Nitze, who opposed the war's escalation, understood that industrial power alone could not guarantee victory, a lesson that should have been apparent from studying Germany's defeat by the Soviet Union despite German industrial efficiency. By the 1980s, as the Cold War entered its final phase, the economic competition Nitze had predicted decades earlier was reaching its climax. The Soviet economy, burdened by military spending and inefficient central planning, was failing to keep pace with Western technological advancement and consumer prosperity. The Reagan administration's military buildup, which Nitze supported, forced Soviet leaders to choose between matching American defense spending or allowing their economy to collapse. They chose the latter, and the Cold War ended not with military confrontation, but with economic exhaustion. This outcome vindicated the fundamental insight Nitze had gained from interrogating Speer. In prolonged competition between industrial powers, economic capacity ultimately determines strategic results. The Soviet Union had been a formidable military power, but its economic system could not sustain competition with America's productive capacity, just as Nazi Germany had been overwhelmed by American industrial might. Paul Nitze lived until 2004, dying at the age of 97, having witnessed the Cold War's conclusion and the emergence of new strategic challenges. Throughout his long career in government and strategic analysis, the lessons learned during those 7 days interrogating Albert Speer remained foundational to his thinking about power, conflict, and international competition. The historical significance of the Speer interrogation extended beyond its immediate impact on bombing assessment or Nitze's personal development. It represented a moment when American strategic thinking began to fully grasp the implications of the Industrial Revolution for warfare and international relations. Wars were no longer won primarily through battlefield maneuver, individual heroism, or even tactical innovation. They were won through sustained industrial production, economic organization, and the ability to convert natural resources into military power. This realization shaped American grand strategy throughout the 20th century. The massive military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned against in his 1961 farewell address was a direct consequence of lessons learned from World War II. America maintained enormous peacetime military production capacity because leaders like Nitze understood that wars were won or lost based on which side could mobilize industrial resources more effectively. The interrogation also revealed the limitations of totalitarian economic systems. Speer had described how Nazi ideology had distorted German economic decision-making, how Hitler's refusal to accept reality had led to catastrophic strategic errors, and how the regime's brutality had ultimately undermined its own war effort. These observations reinforced American confidence in democratic capitalism as not just morally superior, but strategically more effective than alternative systems. Yet the historical record also demands acknowledgement of uncomfortable truths. American victory in World War II was not morally simple. The strategic bombing campaign that Nitze had been evaluating had killed hundreds of thousands of German and Japanese civilians, many in raids that his own reports concluded had minimal military value. The industrial capacity America had wielded so effectively was built partly on racial segregation and the exclusion of women and minorities from full economic participation. Victory had come at enormous cost, and the post-war world America shaped was far from the idealistic vision proclaimed in wartime propaganda. Speer himself remained a morally troubling figure whose testimony could not be separated from his crimes. His cooperation with Allied investigators, including Nitze, had been strategic, an attempt to preserve his life and reputation while Germany's other leaders faced execution. His claims of ignorance about the Holocaust were demonstrably false, and his technical efficiency had enabled mass murder on an industrial scale. That such a man could provide valuable strategic insights did not absolve him, nor did it make his testimony less historically significant. The documents produced from the interrogation, housed in various archives including the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, have been examined by generations of historians seeking to understand World War II's economic dimensions. Researchers have largely validated Speer's statistics about German production, while recognizing that his interpretations were self-serving and incomplete. The interrogation transcripts reveal as much about American assumptions and blind spots as they do about German reality. Modern scholarship has complicated the narrative that emerged from Nitze's interrogation. Recent studies have shown that Allied bombing was more effective in some areas than the strategic bombing survey concluded, particularly in disrupting German oil production and transportation networks earlier than Speer admitted. Conversely, some historians argue that the survey underestimated bombing's negative effects, the diversion of Allied resources, the stiffening of German civilian morale, and the moral costs of area bombing campaigns. What remains undisputed is the fundamental conclusion about American industrial capacity. The United States had achieved during World War II something unprecedented in human history: the simultaneous prosecution of global warfare and maintenance of domestic prosperity. This achievement was not accidental, but reflected decades of industrial development, natural resource abundance, technological innovation, and a political economic system that, despite its serious flaws, proved remarkably effective at organizing production. The comparison between American and German war economies revealed essential truths about industrial warfare. Germany had entered the war with significant advantages: a head start in rearmament, combat experience, interior lines of communication, and access to conquered territories. Yet these advantages had proven insufficient against America's raw productive power. A nation that had been producing automobiles and refrigerators in 1939 was manufacturing tanks and bombers in numbers Germany could not approach by 1943. This transformation had required massive government investment, coordination between public and private sectors, and voluntary cooperation from millions of workers. It had also required a stable political system that could make long-term planning decisions, a financial system that could mobilize capital effectively, and a social structure that maintained cohesion under pressure. Nazi Germany, despite its appearance of strength and organization, had lacked these fundamental attributes. Nitze's later writings reflected on what he called the paradox of industrial power, that nations possessing overwhelming material advantages often failed to translate them into strategic success. America's difficulties in Vietnam, the Soviet Union's quagmire in Afghanistan, demonstrated that industrial capacity alone could not guarantee victory. Yet, in conflicts where both sides could mobilize industrial resources effectively, symmetrical warfare between developed nations, economic capacity remained decisive. The legacy of the Speer interrogation extended into the 21st century, as American strategists grappled with new challenges. China's rapid industrial expansion created a potential peer competitor for the first time since the Soviet Union's collapse. Some analysts argued that America faced a situation analogous to what Nazi Germany had confronted: an adversary with superior industrial capacity, larger population, and growing technological sophistication. Others countered that American advantages in innovation, alliance networks, and institutional quality remained decisive. These debates returned repeatedly to questions that Nitze and Speer had discussed in May of 1945. How do you measure industrial power? What role does technology play in offsetting numerical disadvantages? Can authoritarian systems mobilize resources as effectively as democracies during prolonged competition? The answers remained contested, but the questions themselves demonstrated the enduring relevance of their conversation. Albert Speer died in 1981 while visiting London, his reputation remaining controversial. Some historians regarded him as the good Nazi, a technocrat who had opposed Hitler's excesses and provided valuable testimony about the regime's inner workings. Others saw him as perhaps the most culpable of all Nazi leaders precisely because his intelligence and administrative skill had prolonged the war and thus increased its human cost. Both assessments contained elements of truth. Paul Nitze's final years were spent reflecting on his long career and the strategic challenges facing America in a transformed world. He worried that American leaders had forgotten lessons learned from World War II about the importance of maintaining industrial capacity and economic strength. He criticized both excessive military spending that drained economic resources and insufficient investment in the productive base that underwrote national power. In interviews conducted in the late 1990s, Nitze occasionally mentioned the Speer interrogation as a formative experience. He recalled the surreal quality of those 7 days, sitting across from Hitler's armaments minister, discussing production statistics while outside the windows. A shattered Germany struggled with the immediate aftermath of total defeat. He remembered Speer's precise recitation of numbers, his architect's love of systematic organization, and his fundamental failure of moral courage in serving a genocidal regime. What Nitze had learned from Speer, beyond specific facts about German production or bombing effectiveness, was that modern warfare had become fundamentally economic. Battlefield courage, tactical brilliance, and operational art remained important, but they occurred within constraints determined by industrial capacity. The side that could produce more tanks, planes, ships, and ammunition, that could sustain higher casualties and replace losses, that could maintain economic stability while prosecuting war. That side would ultimately prevail in prolonged conflict between industrial powers. This lesson shaped American strategy for 6 decades. It explained enormous peacetime military budgets, justified intervention in distant conflicts to preserve access to resources and markets, and rationalized alliances designed to aggregate industrial capacity against potential adversaries. It also contributed to American confidence, sometimes excessive confidence, that economic power could resolve security challenges that were fundamentally political or ideological in nature. The interrogation transcripts, declassified and available to researchers, offer more than historical data. They provide insight into how defeated powers rationalize failure, how victors interpret success, and how strategic assumptions are formed through the interaction of evidence and pre-existing beliefs. Nitze had approached the interrogation with specific questions about bombing effectiveness. He emerged with broader understanding about the nature of power in the modern world. As the 21st century progressed and new powers rose to challenge American preeminence, the questions Nitze and Speer had explored in 1945 remained central to strategic discourse. How does a democracy compete economically with an authoritarian state that can direct resources with less political constraint? Can technological innovation offset raw industrial capacity? What happens when the world's largest manufacturer is not aligned with Western security interests? These questions would have been familiar to Nitze, even as the specific contexts differed from his Cold War experience. The fundamental insight remained valid. In a world of industrial nation-states, economic capacity shapes strategic possibilities. Military power projects force, but industrial power sustains it. Victory in prolonged conflict requires not just brave soldiers and brilliant generals, but productive factories, efficient logistics, and economic systems that can bear the strain of war without collapse. The 7 days in May of 1945, when Paul Nitze interrogated Albert Speer, thus represented more than a historical curiosity or bureaucratic exercise in assessing bombing effectiveness. They marked a moment when American strategic thinking fully absorbed the lessons of industrial warfare, lessons that would shape grand strategy, defense planning, and international competition for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The conversation between victor and vanquished, between American analyst and Nazi technocrat, revealed truths about power and production that transcended their immediate context and continued resonating through decades of strategic competition, military planning, and the eternal question of how nations translate resources into security, prosperity into power, and industrial capacity into strategic advantage in an uncertain and dangerous world.